So I'll start by briefly introducing everyone. Down at the end, we have Molly Ford from Salesforce. She's the Senior Director of Global Equality. Then we've got Michele Nyrop, who's the Senior VP of Human Resources at Gap Inc. We've got Rachel Ernst, VP of Employee Success at Reflektive. Tyler Muse, founder and CEO of Lingo Live. And Phyllis James, Chief Diversity and CSR Officer at Mgm. So a wide variety of both industries and sizes of companies represented. And feel free when you all answer your questions, if you want to talk a little bit, especially those companies that might be less familiar about what you do, feel free to do that. So we're talking about diversity and inclusion, which is something that's been talked about on a lot of panels for the last several years. It's been talked about in the media a ton. I've been part of that myself. And what I wanted to start with was, why do you think, despite all the increased attention this issue is getting, that these diversity gaps are so persistent? Why do we still see them across industries? And anyone feel free to jump in here.
Well, I'll jump in first. And I'm with Mgm Resorts International. Sometimes people confuse that with the Mgm studio down in Los Angeles. We actually own a series of entertainment and hospitality resorts based in Las Vegas, but we also are operating in several other venues around the country. And we've been in the diversity and inclusion developmental stage, and I'll call it developmental because it is evolutionary. I don't know that there is a final end point or that there should ever be a final end point, given that human beings are continuously evolving. But I think one reason why this is such a persistent issue is because when companies have typically approached it, they've treated it like a one-off program where you can have a series of trainings and then everybody goes back to their workplaces and nobody really pursues things until the next training. And that really does not work. The most successful initiatives really have to be considered multidimensional and evolutionary. And so the approach has to be from a values or a standpoint. It has to be from a development of a diverse and inclusive culture standpoint, and then integrating diversity into business operations. All of those things have to happen.
There are several things I want to follow up on there before we do. Anyone else want to jump in with that, on that question of why you think that these gaps can be so hard to close?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Again, I'm Rachel. I work at Reflektive, and we're a strategic people management suite. So we have goals and employee surveys, check-ins, things like that. And when I think of any just general challenge in the HR industry that we face, I think about it as being driven in the decisions that happen on a daily basis from us, or our leaders and our employees. And similar to Phyllis, I think it's not just even just one initiative. It's thinking about what's driving the things we decide to do every day and the comments we make every day. And it takes a lot of education to understand these biases. I'm sure we're going to get into this unconscious bias idea, but I think it starts with what's driving me to decide the things I do, how do I change that, and am I willing to take the time to do that? And in the organizations I've worked at, a lot of times it's not high enough priority, right? And it's hard to know how to measure the value that it brings to the organization. So I think it's time and understanding what's driving the decisions we make and being open to changing it, because it can be, it doesn't feel great to be told, oh, you know what, that's actually a bias that you have there. How do you manage that?
Yeah, do you all feel, I know you can only really speak for your own companies, but is it your impression that we're at a point where there's wide recognition that diversity is important, not just for moral reasons, but for business reasons, and that companies are really trying to do everything they can? Or is there a lot of lip service being paid to this issue because companies feel obligated to do it, so they do an unconscious bias training and send everybody home?
I would say, Michele, from Gap Inc., and I would say, I do believe that there's an imperative and that people understand it. I think for us, and it goes back to, I think, Phyllis, what you said, which is what we have to look at is every single day, what's the culture of the organization? Because I think, yes, there's a belief at all levels in our organization for certain, of the business and people imperative of diversity. What that means, though, in terms of behavioral changes that are required every single day from every single leader. And so culture becomes the most important thing, and not the thing that you declare, you put on your website, but the experience that every single employee has every single day. And getting to that and the level of accountability required to get at that is a long, hard road. Without fixing that, all the other things are going to continue to fall short.
Yeah,
Well, I just take issue with that. I don't think all managers agree that there is a business imperative that drives diversity. I have found that, and I've been working in this area for almost 20 years now, I constantly have to explain and reinforce, why is this important for the business of our company? Why is it necessary to drive employee engagement? Why is it necessary to serve our customer markets? And so I know that we want to think the best of everyone, but everybody does not accept that basic premise.
Which is why we're having panels like this one and
That's right.
talking about these issues. Let's get into some of that concrete stuff that this is hard to do. Maybe Molly and Tyler, you want to jump in here. How do you start by defining diversity and inclusion? What does that mean at your companies?
I just want to make sure I understood the first question, which is why these issues exist, why there is a lack of diversity within workforces.
Not how we came to be here, not like we could spend all day getting into
Right.
the pipeline issues and everything else.
Yeah.
More, even as attention has been being paid, why is some golden solution not fix this problem in recent years?
But I think you have to address the pipeline issues. I think you have to address some of the systemic challenges that have led to, the lack of opportunities for people of color, the discrimination that exists, some of the major challenges that put you in a position where you even have to start having some of these conversations. Sure. Because if you don't recognize that, if you don't create a space within your company to really acknowledge what's happening outside of these four walls and what the bigger picture is and the injustice associated with that, then it's really hard, I think, for people to feel like you get it as an organization, which of course you don't. You're constantly trying to make sense of it, but that you want to create a space where people can talk about that. So I think you define it through the culture and how people talk about some of these issues. We read the story about, Accenture does a really cool program, and I think LinkedIn does this as well, where they do all hands on sensitive topics. So they'll have employees submit topics of things that are happening outside of work that are really causing conflict for them. You can take a day off because you're sick, but can you take a day off because of the race relation stuff that's happening in your neighborhood? Can you even talk about that with employees? So Accenture and LinkedIn did this thing where they would talk about that. They'd have an employee come forward and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and what an massive impact that was having on his life, and realize that there's actually a lot of other people in this organization that are facing this same struggle, the same challenge as me. And I think what it also does is it educates people who don't understand it. It helps them actually empathize with what this person had to go through in their life or what they're going through in their community outside of work, and how instrumental having somebody like that in the organization and the perspective they bring can be in our ability to succeed as an organization. So I think if you ignore the bigger picture, if you don't talk about it as a company, then you're going to be really limited in fostering that conversation about what diversity and inclusion really looks like.
It's an interesting tension because on the one hand, as you say, of course you have to acknowledge it, but you can also see companies that will say, oh, well, it's a pipeline issue. That's not really my problem. I can't fix that myself. And it can be used as a kind of scapegoating that you see. I don't know if that's something you all want to speak to. Or Molly, any thoughts on these or the
I think how, so I'm from Salesforce, and how we approach it, and we started our equality journey informally years ago, right? But really the Office of Equality 2 years ago, and I use my hand to make this example. We say, what are the practices that are already your company, and figure out how to add equality to those. So you're weaving in equality into how people do their day-to-day jobs from CEO down, right? So for my company, we're big on events. So when I show up to an event meeting or I'm talking to the leadership, I ask them, will there be pronoun buttons? Is there a gender neutral bathroom? So you're making sure that things that your employees already do. So we already have an online learning platform where employees and customers go learn, okay, how do I add equality to that? Right? So we're looking for ways to really infuse it as part of the culture and the DNA of the company. And every year our CEO stands up and says, what are our 4 core values for the year? And then we get to debate about it, and it's democratized, and any employee can chime in online and say something. And we've said equality is a core value, right? And that gives us a North Star. That means no matter what happens with elections, no matter the news cycle, we know we should be acting in accordance with equality. Right? And that really kind of helps us kind of set the stage. And you were starting to talk about the language, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the definition and the language. And we've asked our employees, and I know it sounds cliche, but we call it a journey, right? Be on a journey for equality. And we say, as part of this journey, declare yourself as an ally. And we purposely didn't say men go be the ally to women or white people go be an ally to a black person. We're not putting a cape on anybody, right? Being an ally means you show up for people, and we made it actionable. Allies have 4 steps. You ask people about their journey, you listen with empathy, you show up. So when South Asia Force has a Diwali festival and you want to wear a sari, you sign up and learn the training and figure out what that means to that culture, that impact, and then you show up for them. And last but not least, we say speak up. So in this day and age of #MeToo, or someone says a racist joke, you're speaking up, right? And it's really a journey that we're asking people to go on to really learn about equality, learn the vocabulary, act in a way.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea. Those are really interesting examples that both seem, obviously like they should be part of this, but also hard to measure. How do you measure?
You say that, but when we
Yeah.
told people don't be racist, that didn't work either, right? So you still have to tell people the behaviors you want them to act with, right? Don't be a creepy bro, that didn't work either, right? So you still have to tell people the behavior you need them to act in, right?
Absolutely. Let's keep going in this vein of any other thoughts to share on this idea of how you define diversity and inclusion, sort of what your goals are, particularly in terms of anything that you might be measuring. How do you break it down and say, okay, is it about the diversity of the talent pools for hiring? Is it more about a survey of employees of how included do you feel? How do you think about it, and how are you measuring whether you're succeeding or not on a year-to-year basis?
Yeah, in my mind, if diversity is working, people are experiencing the work environment in similar ways. And we just did our first employee survey. We're about 220 people, so we're smaller. And when I looked at the data, I cut it by different demographics, right? And one of the things we saw is women are experiencing the workforce differently than men, not surprising, right? And then where specifically is that happening? And it's happening with career growth and leadership. And we just did a whole bunch of focus groups to understand what specifically are you experiencing that's different than perhaps your male counterparts. So we're going to choose a few questions, and we're going to measure that and survey every 4 months.
Is there an example of something they said that you recall?
Well, one of the things that I'm sure we all experience, there are mainly men on our leadership team, and so when women look up and they see mainly men, they usually think, well, I can't see myself in that position, and because I can't model myself after somebody, then I assume that I have limited career growth because it's mainly men who've made it that far. And you hear that in a lot of different, in the Lean-In survey, various surveys as well. Yeah.
I think that we have to approach D&I from a number of different standpoints all at the same time. So it is as much who are the representational models at all levels of leadership in your organization. And if that is not diverse at all levels, then the organization really needs to address that. Because I do think those are false paradigms. when you have all men at the top and women sprinkled in at various lower levels. And so you do have to address the pipeline issue. But at the same time, you have to address the daily experience of every employee, regardless of what level they're at and what their work is, because inclusion has to be a part of the daily experience. And we try to measure that through our annual employee opinion surveys. We have 80,000 employees, so we don't do them once a quarter, we do it once a year. And we ask questions, we have a D&I index, a series of questions on the survey that go to measure how does your individual team leader or manager treat you and others in your workplace on a daily basis. And to me, that's where inclusion, or where the rubber meets the road, because it doesn't matter how many platitudes or slogans companies give lip service to, if it's not really lived in the daily workplace of the organization.
I think that's kind of what I was hitting on, is how you define it depends a lot on the culture and how the people internally define it. So one of the tools that we use, we don't have quite as many employees as you do, but every employee uses Slack. And we use this Slack bot called Allie, A-L-L-I-E, which sends survey questions out to the employee base periodically on things like, it's all diversity and inclusion related. So unconscious bias, it walks through, it'll take like 3 minutes to complete a survey, and it happens probably twice a month. And so over time, our people ops team is collecting all this data and then going back to the company and saying, this is how people feel. When these questions were asked, this is the color at Lingo Live of how we define what unconscious bias looks like here, or how we define the issues that exist within the leadership team. This is specifically what we're not doing well and things that we are doing well.
Interesting. Are there, not to put you on the spot, but any example you recall from that where you saw, oh, here's an issue and we're going to tackle that? Where you
Yeah, I mean, the biggest, and obviously I'm the poster child for this, is what you just mentioned. So, men at the top. So we have an executive team of 5 people, only one of which is a female. So that we got called out for that. We're a very transparent culture. I know Everlane, she said the same thing. We do the same thing. We walk through our board decks with the whole company. And we poll them on what your biggest grievances are. And this actually came outside of Allie. This was like one of the biggest grievances and the things that they wanted us to focus on. And that was one of the pieces. We have a very diverse workforce. We even have it at the management team level. But then once you get above management at the leadership level, there's this drop off. And I wish I had an answer for that. We've been trying to work through that. And that's part of the reason I'm here, is to kind of learn from others and figure out how to work past these issues. But that's one thing that we acknowledged instead of kind of hiding behind and said, look, this is something we know is an issue, and here's our plan.
Yeah, and I want to jump into the fact that you would acknowledge that. So when I went through employee survey results, we were very transparent, like, look, there is this gap, and this is where it exists, and this is what we're going to do. And it was the highest rated all hands meeting that we had ever had. Because they're experiencing it themselves and they just want to know, we see that this is an issue, and being fully open with the data was a huge win for us.
Okay, and we will come back to that issue of transparency. Yeah. One issue that's clearly coming up here is differences in approaching this at different scales. So I wonder if you all can talk about that. If you're already, people here are working at a company that does have 10,000 or 15,000 or more employees, how do you approach perhaps being corrective versus at a company that's newer and starting out, you have a couple hundred employees and you've got more of an opportunity, as they were saying on the last panel, to be like, okay, we're going to get this right from day one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I like what you did there. When we talk about that from a Salesforce standpoint, we've really been pretty transparent in our equal pay audit.
Yeah.
And trust me, we're not bragging and there's no yay, it's equal pay day thing happening at Salesforce, right? We recognize this is a problem, but we talk about this because we're noticing women bringing a gap with them throughout technology and to other companies. And so our message really is, if you have a small company, you have a greater opportunity to start sooner. Right? We have an audit where we're paying out $10 million now after 3-4 years of doing the assessment, and we have 35,000 employees. That's equal pay is something you can start with 500 employees and make a greater impact, right? And build it into your processes and systems from day one. Yeah, I did
Yeah,
that.
very nice. Way to bring it back.
Yeah,
Michele?
I was going to say, being
Yeah.
a company of over 100,000 employees and 50 years of history, some of which is amazing, right? When you think about the gender gap, that is not a place of an issue. We don't have the same issues. Our board, our senior leadership team, it's pretty 50-50 at our leadership team. Most of our brand presidents are women, our CFO, our CTO, our CIO. So that is a core strength of ours that we just can't take for granted and need to work on. On the flip side, for us, in particular in our product-facing functions, the people who make product for our customers, who are increasingly more diverse, we have serious challenges, not just from a pipeline perspective, but also just from a retention perspective. And so that's been a really big focus for us. And it's hard to do, in a big company, hire by hire. So where are there seismic opportunities to make a shift? For us, for Banana Republic, we moved our entire creative function from New York to San Francisco, which was 200 jobs in product functions. So it became a mission for us to say, this is a place, right, where we can start a cycle of something that's different that can help for the entire organization. So we were incredibly purposeful in hiring as it relates to our product folks. But I think what we've found is that until we make product for everyone, we're not going to attract people who want to make product for us. And that has been a really big issue, right? Like, people who want to make product for us want to be able to make it for their families and their friends and be proud of it. And we were just not hitting the mark. And so we have a small but mighty group of people sort of deep in our organization that raised the challenge to our brand president, who said, you tell me what you need and go after it. And so they've grown from 1 or 2 merchants to about 30 people that have both sort of gone into all of our product milestones to make sure that from sketch and trend and concept through all of our color palettes to size, all the way through, that they're inserting themselves in while they've gone back to all of our product training. So every piece of product training now they've gone through to say, how are we being more inclusive from the beginning? And so that team of people literally has probably drove more change in our corporation in the last year and a half than a whole lot of D&I folks and HR folks and others have, because literally from the inside out, they're holding a mirror up to us and they're helping us to solve those problems. And little by little, we're hoping that that will change the product engine, which will then help us to serve our community customers better and start the cycle over for us.
So that really does point up something that I think is truly critical about the success of D&I initiatives in companies. And that is, it really has to be treated as a serious business imperative that has all of the complexity and dimensions of other business problems. And I think you have to have an organized, well thought out business strategy so that you can say, I'm going to address pipeline issues through this series of measures. I'm going to address employee experience issues through this series of measures. And so whereas the first would naturally focus on HR recruitment and retention practices, the second would focus on leadership behaviors, et cetera. And what you just talked about is integrating inclusion into marketing and product operations. And so that is another dimension of D&I. How do you service your entire customer market base from start to finish? And that takes a whole different set of initiatives. And what this really points up, which I think makes the real difference from organizations, and that is your diversity and inclusion team is there to be a catalyst for integrating diversity and inclusion into the core fabric of your culture and your business operations. They're not there to do a few programs now and then, but achieving meaningful and impactful inclusion is the responsibility of every different part of the organization. Everybody doesn't have the same role in it, but everybody has a role. And part of what the D&I team does is to help everybody understand this is what your role is, and we're here to help you with tools so that you can maximize how you're executing your role.
It's interesting to think, both across teams and across industries, these different things that diversity can mean. We've talked about gender, you talk about race, it could also be size. Thinking about the size, if you're in clothing, of your customers, that's really a D&I question. That also gets back to this issue of changing your business because of it. I would love to hear any other examples from you all of a process or a product or anything where you've said, okay, we increased the diversity of our teams, or we thought about that, or we saw an outcome that was different because we had diverse teams working on it. Is there anything that comes to mind?
I don't want to talk too much,
Okay.
but I do have an example. 3 years ago in our company, we were trying to maximize profits. Our margins were not where we wanted them to be. And so the question was, well, we all feel like we're working to peak capacity. How can we possibly do anything more? And so our leadership said, well, are we working as smart as we can work? We're probably working as hard as we can work. And so we set up a series of cross-disciplinary teams. And you might ask, well, why weren't you doing that before? But, it's the way large organizations tend to work in silos. And it was really hurting the business. So achieving diversity of thought and perspective and truly sharing that around specific business problems or processes or practices really made a huge difference. And when everybody went into their work teams, there was no idea that was a bad idea. Everybody eagerly sought just a new idea about how to do something. So to make a long story short, over the course of about 18 to 24 months, we were able to achieve $400 million in cost savings or new revenues by simply pooling the talent that we had and actually practicing what we had been mimicking, diversity of thought, which people were not practicing, but when they saw that they really started to do it, it paid off.
Okay, that's a great example. Tyler?
I was going to follow that, but now I'm like, wow. $400 million. That's amazing.
It is.
I think one of the things that we did early on, so we're an online language coaching platform. We work with software engineers who are English as a second language, and they speak English, but they don't feel confident enough to really contribute their unique potential, which is our mission. So one of the things we recognized early on is we don't have anybody, yes, we can talk to users, but we don't have anybody in the company who really is a user for this. So our fourth and fifth engineers that we hired were actually people just like the folks who we help. And it changed completely the way that we're thinking about solving the problem. Not just from a technical standpoint, literally from a product standpoint. So I would say, having somebody, it's enough to kind of train you from good design research to kind of empathize with your users, but you're never going to be at the level, especially if what you're helping them with is as nuanced as what we are, as you would if you actually come from that community or you live that experience on a daily basis. And so I would definitely advocate, hire your users as people who build your company, and you will see a massive transformation.
Okay,
I can jump in on the hiring side
Sure.
too, since our diversity, a lot of that has come from just thinking about how we're scaling, so we're scaling very quickly. So what we did last quarter is we had our recruiters talk to the hiring managers that are hiring the largest amount of people, engineers and sales and customer success, and we asked them, when you think about adding to diversity in your team, what would that look like? Where do you need to round out your team more? And we got that definition from different hiring managers, and then we built out a sourcing tool. And we had a goal, like X% of candidates coming through the pipeline must be of that diversity. And we started that in the beginning of this year, and half of our hires this past quarter were women. So we actually finally had 50-50 from a diverse set of backgrounds. So we're really proud of that. So you can actually see, once you start tracking, you can actually see the difference.
Okay, in just a minute, we're going to go to the audience for a few minutes of questions. So please be thinking about anything you'd like to ask our panelists. One thing I'd sort of rapid fire before we get to that I'd love to ask you all to share with people here is an example of two things. One, something that you tried in the past to try to work on these issues that didn't work as you had hoped. And a tactic on the other side that you would share with people here, that if you were going to have them go away with one thing, what is something they might do, or that something great that you wish you had done sooner, what are some practical do's and don'ts you could share from your expertise? Molly, do you want to start?
So I think our don't was going out to our diverse employees saying, hey, tap your networks, we're hiring, come on in. That didn't work so well.
Okay. And why not?
Well, first, legal was like, you can't have a spiff that's any higher. Okay, yeah, I had to learn that lesson. Y'all laughing, but I had to learn. So that didn't work. And then just, we really weren't able to come back to the employee and face them and explain what happened with that referral, right? And the amount of employees or job candidates that come through Salesforce was just too large to handle. Hey, I referred my friend Bob, what happened, right? We just couldn't serve that. And honestly, we felt like we disrespected you. We tapped your network, and then you didn't feel like it paid off, right? There were hires, but not the volume to which they'd have saw. And then we felt like the amount of time that we put into that specific effort didn't quite work. What is working for us is really, I call a data-driven approach to equality. Two things. We have a partnership with our government affairs and legal organization where we look at policy on a global basis, but communities we serve, right, where we have employees, where we might have customers, and we really try to say, what does that legislation look like, and do we have an opportunity to impact that, right? You saw that a few years ago when we acquired a company in Indianapolis, and there was a Religious Freedom Act bill, and that bill was saying I could legally discriminate against folks, and we said, well, we have a customer visiting center there. We can't send customers there when they could be discriminated against. That's one of them. And then the other one is how we do executive engagement is we give them a scorecard. It's not a fancy name. It's called Know Your Number Scorecard. And we basically give them the number of women, underrepresented minorities, and people of color, and attritions, hires, promotions. And they're given that data monthly via an email, and it's a dashboard, an analytic dashboard where they can see the data, and we make sure the data is next to their pipeline. So on Monday morning when they're doing their sales call, looking at their pipeline, they also have their people analytics there. And we're also going a step further to send them a monthly email that has prompts. Do this, do that, pay attention to that. You reorged your team. Promotions are coming. Are you looking at a fair and equitable process? For more information, here's who you need to connect to. So giving them prompts on the data and what they should do. And then they're getting this monthly, even though knowing most people's numbers aren't really moving monthly. And then on a quarterly basis, it goes up in front of our co-CEOs, and it's a conversation that's at the CEO level as well as the board level.
Great. I would love to hear in depth from all of you, but we're going to have to do real lightning if we get. No, that was great to get to audience questions. So very quickly though, Michele.
Yeah. I would just say, for us, the biggest shift has been what didn't work was a lot of the programmatic, tops-down academic approach. In particular, when you're talking about thousands and thousands of employees in stores, it just wasn't netting us. I think what has changed for us is the grassroots tap into, get out of the way of our organization, and have a constant, honest dialogue with the teams across the globe.
Okay, Rachel?
Yeah, one thing that didn't work, we created a women's organization in our headquarters in San Francisco at my last company. And we thought, and we went and did focus groups, we thought if we did something similar in other locations, that would be good. And in New York and London, our offices felt like you've now created even more of a divide between men and women, and it just fell flat. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'll piggyback on Molly. What didn't work, we did the same thing. That definitely didn't work. What did work is, again, just that radical truthfulness, transparency, which showed vulnerability at the leadership level, which then created psychological safety across the company for people to speak up and share things in all hands when the format was specifically meant for you to share that. So we had people sharing these incredibly personal stories of things that they've been through where people are crying in the company, and it was incredible to see that happen. And I think had we not been so transparent and honest about what we're trying to do to get better, then people wouldn't have felt psychologically safe to share
Right,
something.
and as Rachel echoes what you said worked for you too, which is this making sure people feel heard even if
Yeah.
the problems aren't solved. Phyllis?
So a big problem for our organization is the fact that 90% of it is frontline workers who do not have access to computers every day as part of their work because they're guest room attendants, valet attendants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we were depending on management team leaders, direct supervisors of work teams to try to foster inclusion through monthly messaging. And so every month we had a different diversity message that we wanted them to share. And some supervisors did it great, and some did it not at all, and some did kind of a poor job of it. So what we're trying to move to now is using technology through a platform that can be accessed by employees on their smartphones. Everybody has a smartphone. We don't know everybody's personal smartphone number, so we've just publicized. You can go onto X app, we call it Leo, and find out messages about this, that, or the other. And I think it's having a better impact.
Okay, great. It's reaching them where they are. Okay, time for a few questions, I think. Do we have microphones out there? Anyone? There's a question here. Great.
So there's been a lot of discussion around the pipeline problem and then also the unconscious bias problem. So I would love to hear how any of you have tackled those things, not just from going in and doing a training, but is there any sort of way that you've changed your process to sort of fix the pipeline problem while also addressing the bias problem?
We have something called the Salesforce interview feedback tool, SIFT. So we found that we had created a culture of, this culture fit interviewing, and that's the guy I want to have a beer with. So having the hiring manager lay out the core competencies to which they're hiring for, and then giving everyone the same kind of scorecard to fill out or questions to ask. And of course, you ask those questions however you want, but just the simple, here, interview my candidate, was happening, right? And you just saw the job description maybe. So we put together a tool where everyone says, what are the core competencies I'm hiring for? And then we ask them to create more diverse slates, right? Look for that diversity. And then that was one of the things we wanted to do to take biases out of our interview process.
Great.
And did you gather data around that? Did it work?
It did. I don't have the data, but it definitely worked.
One thing we did do was we mandated, and literally mandated, a diverse candidate slate policy in conjunction with a job posting policy. So every single job position in the company that's not a frontline position has to be posted and for a certain period of time as a minimum. And in the interview process, there has to be at least one diverse candidate and among a panel of 3 candidates for every management job. And this goes up to presidents of our resorts. And we have found that that has made a difference when people are actually confronted with, I shouldn't say confronted, presented with diverse talent. Then there's no longer an excuse. We can't find any when they're sitting right there in front of you. And people have actually found, hey, I found this great candidate and I never would have looked for that kind of person, or I never would have known of this other great talent unless I had had to go through this process.
And I would say just on the unconscious bias piece of it, one of the things that we have found valuable, so unconscious bias training as a foundation for everyone so that we're building off of a common set of language is important. What's been important for us is sort of what I call the 2.0, which is in particular, again, the product teams. We bring cross-functional teams together from all the pieces of what comes, what brings product to life for us. And we do smaller sessions where they talk about how does unconscious bias show up in how we all work together, and as importantly, how we create product, right? So how we work together, what does that then end up bringing to life for products for our team or for our customers, because we've sort of infused that into the space. So that's been a really nice sort of add for us.
Okay, I think I'm sorry we didn't leave time for more questions. I would love to do a whole nother panel with all of you. It's been wonderful to hear from you. But that's it, we're out of time. Thank you all.
Katy.
Thank you.